Reaching Out for Animal Rights, Roar presents Sister Brother Animal. Welcome to episode 3 of my interview with Jim Mason, author of An Unnatural Order, The Roots of Our Domination and Destruction of Nature and Each Other. We had previously been talking about the beginnings of hunting and how that may have happened when men perceived women as gods because they gave birth to new humans. And so in order to compensate for the women's abilities to forage and nourish the group, the men decided to copy the real carnivores, the cats, to become copycats and to go out and hunt. Because humans are sensitive and compassionate and held the other animals in awe and thought they were magnificent, amazing creatures who could run faster and were absolutely beautiful, and also did all the same things that humans did in terms of eating and copulating and breathing and giving birth and bleeding and living and dying. They held them in great esteem and thought of them as kin or family. And so that going out and hunting with the intention of taking the life of one of those beautiful, amazing creatures was an anathema, a strange and very difficult, stressful thing for humans. We talked about the men going out before hunting, inflicting pain on each other and performing all kinds of rituals in order to desensitize themselves to the pain, suffering, and death that they were planning on inflicting on their sister, brother, animal family. If they had been gone for a few days or even weeks, it was an exciting event for the women when they came back. It was a celebration of uniting and feasting on a dead animal. It was cause for celebration. And that's where we begin for this third episode of the interview with Jim Mason, author of this amazing book, An Unnatural Order, The Roots of Our Domination and Destruction of Nature and Each Other. You describe how they would go out for like days or even weeks.
Yeah.
And the women would miss them.
Yeah, probably took days and nights before and after the hunt for them to get this out of their system and sit around and eat what's left of a deer. It's something for us to think about, that meat eating back then was much different from today when we just go to we don't, but people go to the supermarket and they pick up this shrink wrapped thing, it doesn't even have any blood on it. Doesn't look like it's a part of an animal. There's no ritual. There's nothing. It's like you might as well pick up a bag of carrots to them. There's no ceremony. There's no thought that, oh my God, this is a life of power, a life of kinship, of relatedness, nothing like that.
The next kind of progression that you so thoroughly describe is herding and the herding culture.
Yes.
Describe how and when that might have begun and with predominantly which animals.
Well, it's interesting. What I'm reading now, I've subscribed to academic website publications that keep you posted on the latest papers. This group that I'm involved in is the beginnings of animal domestication, and how did we come to see ourselves as some sort of owner and master of it all. And interestingly, most of the stuff that's coming out is confirming some of the things I theorized when I wrote the book in the early 90s, was that the first people to domesticate animals were hunters. Everything I read says it began with sheep and goats in what's now parts of the mountainous regions of Turkey, northern Syria, Lebanon, the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, the mountainous region. Part of it extends into what's now Iraq and Iran. There's a mountain range there. And as you may know, sheep and goats are mountain creatures. They live up the slopes. The theory, and it seems to be confirmed by the papers I'm reading, is that people that lived in those areas, because there was gradual crowding in the region, and people didn't have freedom to move around as much to forage as they once might have had. Whereas in times when the area was less populated, the foragers could move over dozens and dozens of square miles and not run into conflict. But as people began to raise plants and settle more, the populations would grow to the point where they were sort of constricted or circumscribed in a region, and they had to look harder for food. So that's when the process of domestication, they think, begins. The anthropologists call it intensification. In other words, they had to intensify the search for foods, and the hunters began to specialize in hunting certain animals. They got to the point where instead of hunting all kinds of animals, they would prey on maybe a particular area on the mountain where there was a lot of sheep and goats. And over time, they specialized in being either sheep or goat hunters. And in time, that hunting sort of gradually morphed into sort of taking control of the animals that they were hunting. First, maybe they followed them around. Like, I guess the thing we might be most familiar with is some of the Plains Indians that used to follow the buffalo. They stayed close to a herd, close enough to know all of its patterns, where it migrated, where it had water holes. They became familiar with that herd that they could kind of predict where it would be at any time, and then it would be easier to hunt and kill its members. They think that the hunters of the sheep and goats did the same thing in those mountain areas, and they came to the point where they began to consider a certain group or herd of, say, goats as belonging to them. Some have suggested in the papers I'm reading that maybe in the wintertime they would put out fodder like hay to kind of keep the sheep and goats from wandering away too far, so they would stay in the area and not wander off. Or the hunters would be so familiar with their water holes that they would kind of lie in wait near the water holes. Well, over centuries, maybe millennia of this, they became sort of acclimated and familiarized with this herd. It wasn't like the herd members were tame yet, but there was more human presence closer to the herd. And they noticed something else when they look at the remains of the digs, when they find evidence of this, they're looking at bones, and they find out the anthropologists can tell the bones of the wild animals from the domestic animals because the bones look different once the animal is domesticated. They may be smaller, they may have a different shape to them. So you have the bones that are obviously from wild members, that is untamed, undomesticated members, and compare them to what became domestic sheep and goats. And they can tell that there was a change here, that humans are now beginning to control these animals, and they're not wild anymore. They're under human control. They're being killed at an earlier age. Like one of the things they find is that in the remains where they find evidence of early domestication, most of the bones are of young male animals. They didn't kill the females, they killed the young males. This was probably because they were learning that the more females there are, the more babies there are, the more the herd is going to increase. So don't pick off the females, pick off the males, because one ram in a herd of sheep or goats can father hundreds of calves, kids. Little by little, this specialized hunting gradually morphs into gradual control of the herd by feeding it, by selecting certain animals. And then they think at some point, some of these people learned how to bring an animal, maybe a baby, back to the camp and have it confined, and they would build a stable or a pen. And this animal would be brought up to be quite tame, almost like not quite a pet, but it wasn't afraid of humans and it wouldn't run away. So little by little, they take more and more physical control of the members of the flock of wild sheep or goats. And so over centuries later, they have basically domesticated, created a new kind of animal, a domestic sheep, a domestic goat. And then sometime later, cattle, horses, pigs, other species that become the barnyard animals of today. So they think that's how it began. Population pressure, population density, forcing people to look harder for food, forcing them to look for new ways to provide food. Hunting becomes intensified into special hunting always for certain animals in certain places. And in time, they become domestic livestock.
I thought the phrase food on the hoof.
That's right.
Was interesting. I've never really heard that before.
Well, it's interesting too, when people began to live off of animals, whether they hunted so-called wild animals, that is animals not under our control, wildlife, or when they began to move with the herds of animals that they had domesticated or enslaved, it gave them ability to move into unfamiliar ecosystems. Like if you're living off of plants, nuts and berries, they're seasonal and they're usually found in a narrow ecozone. Like if you're in tropical Africa living off of nuts and berries and plants that are there, you can't easily go 5,000 miles away to like Central Asia because they're different plants. You can't just go there and live off of plants. But you can live off of animals just about anywhere because meat is meat, whether it's in Africa or in Central Asia or wherever, whatever continent you're on. So it enabled human beings, the hunting and herding and meat eating basically enabled us to move with the food and not be confined to ecosystems where we didn't know what to eat. We could go anywhere. It's kind of a mixed bag.
What do you think of the theory that it started in the north, where maybe humans migrated north, 70,000 years ago, and then found themselves in winter when then they followed the herd to warmer climes?
May very well have happened like that. These are areas which haven't been maybe as rigidly explored just yet. But certainly living off of animals, whether they be wild or domestic, certainly allowed mobility. Like you say, the walking larder, food on the hoof. You you can carry the animal is alive and you can follow it anywhere. So you always have some food supply in reserve for you.
The picture that you painted in An Unnatural Order really blew my mind of the herder culture and what that meant in terms of land and water and relations with meeting other people.
Yeah, I'm finding now in reading these papers that I'm part of this group that the warlike pastoralists, they call them, the mounted nomads, the fierce tribes that lived following the herd and dominating wherever they went because they had to have grass and water. So they became quite competitive with other people, not only the settled farming people, but other herding groups. Some of these become later in the history or prehistory, become the Mongols and the Huns and the Assyrians and the really warlike tribal people that dominated much of the known world. I guess Genghis Khan and some of the others are the most famous for their marauding and their dominating the landscape because they were fierce and they were warlike and they were dangerous. Because they moved with the herd, they had to basically take over every place they went to keep the herd alive, grass and water. That kind of culture, that militaristic, male-dominated, warlike culture comes much later. I'm finding out that doesn't happen as early as I thought. It takes quite a few thousand years before the people who started herding sheep and goats and cattle become the horse-mounted warriors, the Scythians and the people that terrorized the known world by the time of the Greeks and the Romans. They became the Visigoths and they conquered Rome, and they were warriors on horseback. But it comes much later. That doesn't happen in the early stages of domestication. In the early stages, there's pretty much settled farming, some plant-based agriculture with some barnyard animals, maybe some pigs and some sheep and some goats. Over time, centuries, millennia later, some of those herdspeople became the mounted nomads, the armed scourge of the plains that actually some American scholars of Native American history see the same parallel in North America. They see that once some of the Indians of the plains, the middle American, of us now Midwestern states, once they discovered the horse, which were runaways from Mexican ranches, became the wild horses of the West. The Lakota Sioux and the Comanche and the Cherokee and a lot of native tribes became horseback riding Indians, native peoples on horseback. And they became what they call the scourge of the plains. They tended to terrorize and dominate other tribes and overrun them. And they were fierce and they were warlike because, again, herds people are very powerful. They need to maintain their animals. They have to have grass and water. And they find that they're much more effective and more powerful mounted than they would be otherwise. So we see that kind of pattern where the mounted people and the people with the larger animals, whether they be cattle or horses, tend to become more competitive, more tribal conflicts, more domination of territory and space, and more conflicts with other more peaceful groups.
That kind of twist in the mentality of humans, it seems, started with just turning something off, our empathy, in order to kill anybody. In this case, hunting animals, killing animals. That was the first distortion of our emotional, mental, psychological makeup, I think. And you described competitiveness, the individuality, the fierceness, the willingness to kill another human in order to feed their herd.
The chapter in the book, it explains how these mounted nomadic pastoralists, they call them, the people on horseback with herds of cattle, became the dominant tribes in the region because they tended to take over so much space, established the first great kingdoms, the first great city-states, the first great wealth of the Middle East by the time history begins in Samaria. As one after another of this succession of one of these tribal groups dominating all the others. I think there's references to it in the Bible, like how the Hebrew people, who were relatively more peaceful nomads, they had sheep and goats, but they were overrun by Nebuchadnezzar and they were forced to go into the exile. And Jews were removed from their native land and forced to go to Egypt to become slaves. So some of the more dominant herdspeople would push the others around and get them out of their way so they could have their water and their pasture and their space and establish their own city-states, some of which became very powerful. We like to brag about the treasures today, the great temples of Nebuchadnezzar and towers of Babylon and all these things. They were really built on slavery and the domination of animals and other people. So the glory and the splendor of those relics, of those monuments, sort of has another side to it, doesn't it?
Indeed.
Some of the mounted tribespeople were some of the first imperialists. Imperialists in that they basically overran other city-states, other nation-states, and brought them under control.
By killing a lot of people.
Yeah, and enslaving the women and the children.
Right.
So they built their wealth and their power.
So your fourth chapter of An Unnatural Order is called Agriculture, a new relationship with nature and a new world order for living beings. So what is agriculture? When, where, and how did it begin? And how would you describe the transition from forager agriculturalist to sedentary agriculturalist?
Interestingly, the domestication of animals occurs at about the same time and in the same place as the discovery of plant agriculture or horticulture. It seems, again, because of this crowding, because of this condensation of peoples in an area which kind of limited their foraging radius. They had to stay more or less in one place. And there was a tendency of people to go where the food supply was most plentiful, and that tended to be around water. If you look at the map of where agriculture began around the world, there's 4 or 5 major centers where they find the beginnings of agriculture, plant agriculture. And they're all in river valleys and marsh areas where there's a lot of water and a lot of biodiversity, a lot of different kinds of things. Like the Native American populations in North America, for example, were most dense and most populous along the East Coast because of the wetlands, because in the marshlands and the wetlands and the tidal flats, you have a lot of sea creatures as well as land animals. So it's a good place to hunt and fish, in other words. And when they were more or less confined and restricted in their movements, they would have to kind of set up camp, so to speak, more or less permanently in a place where there was food supply, because you weren't allowed to go that far away anymore. Or if you did, you'd run into a fight with some neighbors. And so people were kind of forced to settle, and anthropologists call it intensify the food production. Instead of foraging so much, they had to learn to stay in one place and started with barley, I think, and wheat, these plants that tended to grow year after year in the same place. Over time, the social group, the extended family and the tribe, that language group would stay in that area and settle down and live in structures and become farmers, because they couldn't go out and go very far anymore. And the same thing applies to hunting. When the Middle East is filling up with people camped out, you can't just go hunting anywhere, not only because you'd run into fights with the neighbor who are trying to do the same thing, but the animals would be more or less hunted out, wouldn't they? There wouldn't be herds of deer left because they would have long since been killed off by you or your neighbors. So hunting, at least at a great distance, becomes less and less of an option, which is why population buildup and population concentration kind of force people to settle down and cultivate plants and tend to their flocks, manage animals, and keep them in place near the camp in a farm setting of a barnyard and fields of crops. And after centuries of this, some of those places became villages. The people lived there year-round forever. They didn't forage anymore. Or if they did forage, they couldn't go very far. All of this occurs today, we call the Middle East, the Fertile Crescent, which stretches from the eastern end of the Mediterranean up in the mountain range and down to what's now Iraq, the Tigris and the Euphrates. That's the Fertile Crescent. And all of this settling down and tending to plants and animals first occurs, at least in the West, in that area, in that region. Similar things happened in parts of Asia, especially in Southeast Asia. Something similar was happening along the Nile in Africa, which gives rise to the Egyptian civilization by the time history begins. People had been farming up and down the silted plains from the floods of the Nile season after season for thousands of years, and it became Egypt and the Egyptian culture. Something similar happened in Central America when some of the early Mexican era cultures, the Toltecs, the Olmecs, the Mayans, and them learned how to cultivate corn. Again, because of the constriction of the population, hunting and foraging becomes less and less of an option. You have to stay in one place and intensify food production. You have to grow plants.
So how would you compare the life, let's say, of those sedentary, fixed, circumscribed, to compared to forager?
Well, some
and
interesting.
Their health.
Yeah, well, health and nutrition become a challenge. We're finding that once people settle down and live in the same place, they have diseases that they never had before. Diseases like cholera and some of the other diseases that are from living around your own refuse, your own waste, where populations of bacteria can build up. You wouldn't have been exposed to them when you were on the move all the time, because when a group, a band, or a small tribe moved from place to place, they'd leave the waste behind and they'd go somewhere else and find food. But once we live in the same village, year in and year out, over, say, a lifetime, all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, it's very gradual. You get populations of pathogens, of germs that you never had before. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, measles, things that we never experienced when we were always on the move. When people were on the move, they might have had malnutrition occasionally if they were having a bad season, or if there had been like a climate disaster which limited the plant food supply. But once people lived in villages that depended on crops, they could have crop failures a few years in a row. They could have a drought. So say if people were living along the Tigris and the Euphrates, living off of fields of wheat, newly domesticated wheat, they could be wiped out if they had 2 or 3 years in a row of bad crops, because foraging for food was no longer an option. So some of those villages, for the first few centuries and probably millennia of agriculture, they had hard times some of the time. And again, the Bible gives us several accounts of this. So like when there was a famine, they were always having a famine someplace. Again, because of climate disasters. Flooding could wipe out croplands. Forest fires could wipe out crops and settlements. Living in agriculture was not always food secure, as we like to think. We like to think that once they learned to raise their own food, they had it made and never looked back, but it wasn't that easy for a long time. And then, of course, you always have the conflicts with your neighbors. If they were starving, they might look upon your croplands with, might be a little more competitive to get that food. So we had more social conflicts. People are pressed in more together, and there's more competition for food. So it wasn't all rosy. And I think the Bible and the creation story kind of suggests that when Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, all of a sudden life was hard. It wasn't so rosy anymore. And some have speculated that this might have marked the folklore and the mythology that happens in the early days of agriculture, that they looked back to an earlier time when they were foragers, when they had a more diverse diet. They had more of a rich food supply. Looking back on that with fondness, now they're after they're thrown out of the Garden of Eden, agriculture seems so rosy. It's hard work. You eat the same thing all the time. It's not, the nutrition takes a plunge. You got diseases you never had before, so there's hardship.
Would you link that to the good and evil kind of view of nature, wild nature and domesticated nature? And
Yeah. So it's interesting how the creation story, our creation story, the Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden idea, reflects a kind of a nostalgia for the primal forager way of living, where they had much better nutrition. And this has been measured, by the way. This is just theorizing. A writer by the name of Mark Nathan Cohen wrote a book, something about the title of Human Health. It's mentioned in my book, where he looked at the evidence of the health of the pre-agricultural people, the tribal primal forager people, compared to those 1,000 years or so into agriculture. And they look at their teeth and they look at their bones and the density of they have all kinds of indicators of what kind of health they had. And they found that the forager people had really generally had much better health than the farmer people some thousands of years later. They had a more varied diet. They didn't have the diseases. They had a better health environment as foragers than they did as settled farmers, at least up until relatively recent times, up to, say, the 20th century. They measure the height, the length of the skeletons, the nature of the bones and the teeth, and they can tell what kind of health they had.
Yeah, I found that fascinating that the foragers had lost maybe 2.5 teeth when they died, and the agriculturists had lost 3.5 teeth when they died. And then Romans lost 6 up to 6 teeth when
the height, the average height changed drastically. Like some of the forager people's body size was comparable to us today, whereas during the farming period, they're much shorter, which suggests poorer nutrition, more stresses.
You really bring us through history that I've never contemplated before. It was really eye-opening. We've been talking with animal advocate, journalist, lawyer, researcher, and author of this book, An Unnatural Order, The Roots of Our Domination and Destruction of Nature and Each Other. The depth and the breadth of this book is mind-blowing. Thank you.